Hey, what's up? So this is a follow-up video to the video I made called Atheism Only Exists Because of Theism, I believe is what it's called. Yeah, pretty much. So I guess to clarify some things, I should just say, I suppose I should have been more obvious when I said that atheism only exists because of theism, in the sense that atheism, the need to defend that position, only exists because of theism. Because I've seen some comments of people saying that, oh, yes, atheism is the default, which I don't necessarily disagree with either, because I even mentioned in that video, perhaps you didn't even watch it, but, I do admit that I didn't outwardly say that I'm talking about atheism in the sense where you have to defend it to theism. But um, yeah, I can see that atheism arguably would be the default, but I don't necessarily, you know, disagree that the notion of believing in God also comes from people ourselves, because as human beings, we have a bias to, pretty much anthropomorphize stuff. Like, it's a joke along the like the Pixar films, like, oh my gosh, what if feelings had feelings? Inside Out. What if bugs had feelings, A Bug's Life? Or what if cars had feelings? Blah blah blah. That's what we've done throughout human history. We've, anthropomorphized things, and the notion of God is basically, okay, how about a supreme being that looks after us? There must be a supreme being that like knows all the answers, because, we stupid humans are not clever enough to, come up with anything. But I acknowledge that, yes, that is just something that is completely made up. So as I think about it now, whether or not atheism or theism comes first, well, they're human concepts, basically. Let's just leave it at that. But another reason I wanted to make this video is because I guess I wanted to posit the question, where exactly does life come from? And there are a whole bunch of angles to take this, but if you also did watch that video, I kind of got into like a back and forth with somebody in the comments, and we led a little bit about determinism, which, I'll talk about later. But basically, they mentioned that the double slit experiment proves that the universe couldn't be deterministic. But I heard something called superdeterminism, which would essentially, demonstrate that, I guess, perhaps there's a hidden variable that would explain why, oh, how is it that light is a wave? But, Einstein's also over here saying that, oh, it behaves as, particles too. How do those two things coexist together? So I wanted to focus on that a little more, because there's an idea that, okay, DNA had to have been created by some sort of like coder or whatever. But I don't really believe that, because I think, at least scientifically, on a practical level, the more we look for explanations and things and whatnot, I don't understand how you wouldn't be able to see the world as more and more deterministic. Because I mean, back then, people relied on religion and spirituality a hell of a lot more before we could explain things like how the weather works or how this or that. Because a lot of times, kind of like what I mentioned, when I say that people have a bias to, anthropomorphize things, or, oh, there must be some sort of like being behind it, because we see ourselves as, you know, these beings, so there must be a higher, quote unquote, like being or something above and beyond. But no, it's just natural and material stuff. So I've been asked this question before, okay, how can life come from non-life? But I think it's a biased question that a lot of religious people have, because when you say life, what exactly does that mean? Because life is obviously not explained in the same way for every single creature. For example, a jellyfish doesn't have a brain, but it's alive because it has like a nervous system or something, or like whatever the fuck makes it alive. It doesn't have a brain though, much like a starfish as well, but it's also considered alive. But also, we can also just explain this like evolutionarily. So I don't understand how this would defeat the deterministic process and whatnot, because obviously throughout evolution we've adapted to, suit our environment. The ones that couldn't, they died out. That's why there's a thing called, natural selection. So this special connotation that religious, theistic, like spiritual people place to life is kind of stupid in my eyes, because like it's a roll of the dice, basically, who gets to, have life. And even then, what makes life like more justified, quote unquote. Like we consider sea creatures alive, but if I pulled a fish out of the water, it wouldn't be able to breathe. It would essentially suffocate. But if you take a human and force them to live underwater, that person would end up drowning. We still need water, but we can't live underwater, obviously. So all these like setups and all these like rules as to how something exists, like there's no universal definition for life. If you cut like a gecko's tail off, it's just going to grow back, right? If you cut like the limbs of a person, they're going to bleed out and die unless, you obviously take care of that. You can live without your limbs, obviously. I know there are like amputees and shit. But basically it's a nonsensical question, basically. And you can look over like the veganism debate where people are like, oh, plants are still alive, so vegans are still doing harm, and the vegans will argue back saying like, oh no, plants can't feel pain or like whatever. They don't have like a nervous system for pain or some shit. However it is that they want to argue, like I'm not fucking vegan or anything like that. But basically, my whole point or the thing that I'm trying to say is that like yes, there is no universal definition for life. So how is it exactly that you can claim life more than like someone else? Because like I know that we as humans like to prioritize ourselves better because we can talk about like theoretical, sort of concepts. And you don't imagine, let's say, for example, that like a dog is trying to wonder about like the meaning of life or some shit. But like nobody's going around saying that like dogs aren't alive or that like other, you know, mammals and whatnot like are not alive. But basically, yes, we notice like all these, sort of differences and whatnot. So what species actually gets to claim, the title of life and whatnot? And why would we need God for this? Because at least from like an evolutionary perspective, yes, kind of like what I've already said, we adapt to our environment. And that's what I mean. It's like roll the dice. So to me, it speaks that there isn't exactly like a full, like a fully thought out like method by like the creator, quote unquote. Because like hypothetically, why couldn't it have been you like years and years within evolution to be the one that like died out that like couldn't keep up with like the environment basically, which is why I think it's like super dumb when like religious people are like, oh, the universe is crafted so perfectly to let's say hold and sustain life. Well, I mean, that pretty much discredits, okay, what about people that are only alive just because of like other people? They need other people to like take care of them. Or what about people that already have died? That have already died from like diseases that were like out of their control, or people that are alive but struggle and have like much more of a difficult life than you because let's say they have these like debilitating mental illnesses or debilitating like physical disabilities and whatnot. So it's just like the title of life is just like roll of the dice. So to me, it doesn't really point out that like there was intense like thought put into this. Like one day someone was like, "Oh, you're just gonna have this disorder. You're just gonna have that disease. You're gonna be more or less okay, but you're gonna be blah blah blah, this and that," or like yeah. So basically, it's just like a random game of probabilities, like set up by nature or something. So all of this can literally be explained without the use of like a god. So this idea that the earth, the universe like perfectly sustains life is just, like your illusion because you just so happen to be somebody that doesn't have something like oh so crippling or so like, whatever. So where life comes from or like whatever is like such a stupid question to me because basically the notion of like evolution just arbitrarily picking who gets to live and who gets to die, who gets to be functional, who gets to be non-functional or whatever, or these struggles, that struggles, depending on like your perspective on like the hierarchy of like difficulty and whatnot, like it's just going at like a random draft. So you can see people that are, let's say, alive just because other people take care of them. And like in a way, who's to say you can't make an argument that like, oh, okay, like this person is barely alive. Because if nobody cared enough, they would simply just perish on their own. So, like, I feel like if you say you have the privilege, or like if you say that, like, oh, that yeah, the privilege to say that like, oh, we live in such a finely created world that was like created by God and was all articulate it was designed with such like articulation than just like, okay, that's just like willful ignorance. Just because you're not going to constantly think about the people that are struggling, constantly you're not going to think about the people that are like, having a hard time, that like it doesn't like take away that like all of that is still happening. So if we were to truly compare and contrast, in a way you can make the argument that essentially you only have a sustainable life because somebody else got the bad luck spin on the arbitrary slot machine of nature handing out random diseases or genetic like like malfunctions to other people. So I don't care in a way what about the question of like, okay, how can life create like, like non-life? Because it's like it's an empty question. Like you're not even actually like asking anything. And the only thing that I've noticed and that we all ought to notice if we're not lying to ourselves about like afterlives and whatnot. But like regardless, even if you're having a more decent time than somebody else with like a crippling disability, we're all gonna die anyway. Nature does not fucking care about us. Like I said in my video about meaning being a gambling addiction, essentially, kind of like being at the casino. Okay, go play for a little bit. That's what nature said. Go play for a little bit, but then overall, nobody actually matters. So I guess to like wrap this all up, like overall, I'm just like I don't understand that question. Like, how can life come from like non-life? I'm just like, okay, life. Yeah, the stupid facade. Yeah, yeah. We're no, no. It's not even how can life come from non-life. It's just, okay, here we are with our stupid facade because sure, some of us can sustain ourselves better than others, but either way, we're all just running out, and that's the reality of the situation.